Today you will hear the testimony that the Iranian government never wanted the world to know. Farid Nazari, a respected, feared, and obeyed colonel, was the very image of loyalty to Islam and to the army, until the day a simple video by Charlie Kirk began to destroy everything he believed in. With each word, Farid felt his world collapse. The man who prayed 5 times a day began to doubt the God he served. What seemed like harmless curiosity turned into an obsession, and then a deadly persecution. What he saw on that screen would lead him to a supernatural encounter in the desert, a dream that would change the course of his soul, and a trial that almost cost him his life. Secret prisons, betrayals within the army, and an impossible decision. Deny his faith or die for it? Get ready. What you are about to witness is real and will leave you breathless. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which city and country you are watching from. That way I'll know how far this message is reaching.
My name is Farid Nazari, and I remember the sound of the wind cutting through the narrow streets of Bandar Bushehr, mixed with the scent of spices and sea salt that always hung in the air. It was late afternoon, and the call to prayer echoed from the mosques like a steady heartbeat pulsing through the entire city. My mother hung clothes in the courtyard while whispering her prayers, and my father, his hands always marked by labor, returned from the bazaar covered in dust and sweat, carrying the rice and herbs he had sold since before I was born. I grew up believing that this was the center of the universe, that serving Allah and my country was the noblest mission a man could have. From an early age, I learned there was no room for doubt. Doubt was weakness. And weakness did not belong in the blood that ran through the veins of an Iranian. I was the second of 4 brothers, and perhaps because of that, I always carried the desire to prove my worth. As a child, I remember kneeling on the prayer rug, trying to imitate the serenity of my mother. She prayed with her eyes closed, as if speaking to someone who truly listened, while I merely repeated words I did not fully understand. Sometimes I looked up at the sky and wondered if Allah really saw children, if he could hear the heart of a boy who wanted to understand why he had to kneel 5 times a day. But I never dared to ask. In the Iran of my childhood, questions about faith could be dangerous. With time, I stopped being the curious boy and became the ambitious young man. In my teenage years, I already dreamed of the uniform, the sound of polished boots striking the ground, the honor of marching under the flag of my homeland. I remember the first time I saw a group of soldiers passing through the city. Their uniforms aligned, their faces serious, the authority in each of their voices. I felt a spark inside me. That was the path. I would be a man of discipline, of power, of respect. At 18, I signed my commitment to the army and left behind my home, my family, and any trace of innocence that remained. The military life shaped me. I learned to silence what I felt, to obey without question, to turn fear into strength. Under the relentless desert sun, I learned what endurance truly meant. The hours of training felt endless, the weight of the rifle multiplied with the heat. But something in me liked that pain. It made me feel in control. And the higher I climbed, the more I believed I was fulfilling a purpose. In my early 20s, I was already leading squadrons, and by 30, I earned the title of colonel. A title that for many represented the peak of success, but for me began to feel like an invisible prison. I was the man everyone respected, the commander with the firm voice, the stern eyes, the example of discipline. My uniform was always impeccable, my house always in order, my speech always the same: honor, duty, and faith. But inside me, there was a deafening silence. In the dawns by the Gulf, when the sound of the waves was the only living thing, I felt a strange distance. The God I had been taught to serve seemed farther and farther away, more abstract, more unreachable. I recited the prayers, but the words felt empty, like sand slipping through my fingers. I began to realize that the answers I sought were not in the repetition of gestures, but in something I had yet to discover. It was during that time that a soldier under my command caught my attention. Navid, a quiet young man, disciplined but different. He never joined the collective prayers. One day, while making rounds in the barracks, I saw a faint light under his blanket. I opened the door, ready to reprimand him, and found him reading a small book with a dark cover. When I asked what it was, he simply looked up and calmly replied, "It is the word of God." I should have reported him. That was what the law required. But something stopped me. His eyes carried a peace I had never seen in anyone before. It was as if nothing could shake him. I, the colonel, the man who commanded dozens of soldiers, felt small before that look. I left the room in silence and for some reason told no one. That night haunted me for weeks. Shortly after, I met Mina Sarkis. She was unlike any woman I'd ever known. She had a serenity that was almost impossible to explain. She worked in a small market, helping her father sell bread and olive oil, and it was there that our eyes met. I saw her smile at a child, and that moment was etched in my memory. When I approached her, her voice was gentle, steady, and sure. I found out she was an Assyrian Christian, born into a family that lived discreetly because of their faith. Our relationship began cautiously. I was a devout Muslim officer in the Iranian army, and she was a woman who spoke openly about Jesus as if he were a friend. That unsettled me. "Does he hear you when you speak?" I asked once. She smiled. "Yes, he always hears." I did not know how to respond. In my faith, God was a distant Lord, and Mina spoke as if she were talking to someone right beside her. We married quietly, without celebration, only with the blessing of our families. My parents were not happy. They believed that a man like me should marry a Muslim woman, but I was determined. There was something about Mina that made me feel at peace. On our wedding night, she did something I will never forget. She sat beside me, took my hand and prayed, "Jesus, thank you for Farid. Bless our life and guide us." Those simple words moved me deeply. I did not know how to pray like that. I spoke to God with fear and distance. She spoke with love and closeness. Over time, I noticed Mina always carried a book with her, an old, worn Bible. She read it every morning before the sun rose. Sometimes I watched her secretly, trying to understand what she found in those pages. She seemed so at peace that it irritated me. I, a respected colonel, a man of honor, did not have that same serenity. During the day, my life was a sequence of reports, strategies, and commands. I planned border patrols, coordinated missions, and supervised soldiers who called me "sir" with reverence. The routine was predictable. Wake before dawn, review maps, inspect weapons, lead drills, everything meticulously calculated. And yet, something inside me was out of order. The nights were my battlefield. I lay down exhausted, but sleep would not come. I would stare at the ceiling, feeling a weight I could not explain. Sometimes I remembered the crucifix I had seen in a neighbor's house when I was a boy. That small, simple symbol that had left me unsettled. It was as if an old memory were trying to awaken. I fought against it, forced myself to pray. But each time I repeated the prayers, I felt like I was speaking to the walls. The faith I had been taught seemed built on fear. The God I knew was a severe judge, ready to punish every mistake. But Mina's God seemed like a father who loved. I could not understand this difference, but it fascinated me. Then came the phase when everything began to collapse, the crisis that would break me from the inside. I was at the peak of my career, carrying medals, respect, and power. But the emptiness grew like a shadow. On missions, I watched my soldiers praying and wondered if any of them truly believed in what they were saying. When I looked into their eyes, I saw the same weariness I felt in myself. At home, things also began to change. Our eldest son, Arman, came back from school one day with a downcast face and tears in his eyes. "Father, they called me a dirty Christian," he said. I lost my breath. I felt a mix of anger and guilt. Part of me wanted to go to the school and confront whoever had hurt him. Another part knew that this pain was the consequence of something I myself had allowed. For the first time, I realized that my wife's faith was not just a choice, it was a risk. That night, sleep did not come. I spent hours tossing in bed, my head full of questions. Why, even with everything I had achieved, did I feel empty? Why did I feel envy at my wife's peace? Why did my heart seem to be asking for something I did not know how to give? I picked up my phone and began browsing the internet, trying to distract my mind. It was then that the algorithm did what faith had not yet done. It recommended a video by Charlie Kirk. The title said, "Former Muslim reveals what he discovered about Jesus." I clicked out of curiosity. I wanted to understand the arguments, maybe refute them mentally, like a good officer trained to distrust everything. But as Charlie spoke, something in me began to tremble. He did not attack. He questioned, calmly, with reason, with truth. Each word was like a hammer striking the wall I had built inside myself. He spoke about freedom, about seeking truth above fear, about a God who does not demand sacrifice, but offers love. I spent hours watching, one video after another, interviews, debates, testimonies. Each story seemed to speak directly to me. I, the Colonel, the Iron Man, began to feel my heart beat like that of a boy. That dawn, I realized something was beginning to break inside me. The following weeks were a mix of discipline and desperation. During the day, I remained the respected leader, the exemplary officer. At night, I was a divided man. The power I possessed no longer satisfied me. The respect of my soldiers did not bring peace, and each time the sun set, I thought of the words I had heard in one of those videos, "The truth does not fear being questioned." On a mission at the border, the desert wind blew so hard, it seemed to want to tear the soul from my body. I was alone, watching the golden horizon, and suddenly, without planning, I fell to my knees in the sand. For the first time, I did not make the gestures I had been taught. I did not recite memorized words. I simply looked at the sky and murmured, "If you are real, Lord, show me." It was the most sincere request I had ever made in my life. And although the desert was silent, something told me the answer was coming. I just did not imagine how it would transform everything. That night was different from all the others. The desert was colder than usual, and the wind seemed to whisper something I could not understand. Inside the tent, the silence was heavy, and the only audible sound was the beating of my own heart. I lay down, trying to silence the thoughts that tormented me, but they came in waves. Mina's face praying, Armand's cry, Charlie Kirk's words echoing in my mind, speaking about truth, courage, and faith in the midst of darkness. I closed my eyes, exhausted, and asked again, in a voice almost inaudible, "If you are real, Lord, please show me." Sleep came over me suddenly, but it was not an ordinary rest. It felt as if my body had stayed there, but something in me was being taken to another place. At first, I saw only a soft glow, as if the air itself were lit. Little by little, that glow became a golden field, illuminated by a light that did not come from the sun. The wind there was light, almost a song, and the air carried the scent of life. I felt completely awake inside that dream, so real I could feel the touch of the wind on my skin. Suddenly, before me, a figure approached. A man in white garments, simple and pure, walked toward me. My heart began to beat so hard I thought I would faint. There was no doubt that gaze contained everything: authority and love, fire and mercy, power and peace. When he looked at me, I could not hold his gaze. It was as if every sin, every lie, every fear were being revealed there without him needing to say anything. Yet in the midst of the shame, there was something stronger, an indescribable love that completely enveloped me. He stopped in front of me. His lips did not move, but I heard his voice. It was not a sound that entered through my ears. It was something that passed through my chest, like a gentle thunder speaking directly to my heart. He said only, "Farid, follow me." Those words echoed inside me with a force impossible to describe. I wanted to answer, but I could not. All I could do was fall to my knees. The man reached out his hand and touched my shoulder. In that instant, I felt something breaking inside me, as if invisible chains were snapping one by one. The weight I had carried for years, guilt, fear, pride, disappeared. I felt light, completely free. The wind blew again, and this time it wrapped me with warmth. He did not need to explain anything. I knew. He was the one Mina always spoke about, the Jesus believed in, the living God. Suddenly, the golden field began to dissolve into light, and before I could say anything, I woke up. I was inside the tent, my body covered in sweat, my heart racing and my face wet with tears. But they were different tears, not of pain, not of fear. They were the tears of someone who had finally found what they were searching for without knowing it. I looked around and realized everything seemed different. The air had a different weight, the night had a different color. I felt such deep peace that I could hardly believe I was awake. In the morning, when I returned to the base, the soldiers greeted me as usual, but I saw each of them with new eyes. It was as if the world had been painted again. The things that once seemed huge, power, command, respect, now seemed small, almost insignificant. There was something greater, something real, and I could no longer pretend I did not know. When I got home, Mina looked at me before I said a word. She saw it in my eyes. She did not ask anything. She only smiled with tears in her eyes and held my hand. There was no speech, no explanation. She simply prayed softly, as she did every morning. That simple gesture was more powerful than any sermon. In the days that followed, I began to connect the dots. I remembered the crucifix I had seen as a child, that small symbol that had never left my mind. I remembered the Bible in Navid's hands, the look of peace he had, the way Mina spoke of Jesus as if she knew him personally. I remembered the words of Charlie Kirk, which had echoed so many times inside me when I was still trying to understand what was true. I realized all those things were signs along the way, traces left by a God who had been searching for me before I even knew how to search for him. One morning, I asked Mina to let me see the Bible. She stayed silent for a few seconds, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Then she went to the bedroom and came back with the worn, covered book, its pages yellowed and full of small notes in the margins. When she placed the book in my hands, I felt something unexplainable, as if I were holding something alive. I opened it without knowing where to begin, and my eyes fell on John chapter 14, verse 6. I read aloud, trembling, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I stopped. I read it again, over and over. The words seemed to leap from the pages, as if they were being spoken at that very moment, directly to me. I felt again that warmth in my chest, the same presence from the dream, and I understood. This was it. This was the truth I had been searching for, the truth that could not be controlled by fear or tradition. From that day on, I began to read in secret. Each page was a mirror, showing how much I had tried to live by my own strength. I discovered a God who did not demand that I prove my worth, but offered me grace. I discovered a love not bound to religion, but one that set me free. It was then that Mina took me to meet a small group of Christians who gathered discreetly in a secluded house on the quietest nights. There, I met Pastor Yusuf Rahmani, a man with a tired appearance, but eyes full of life. He listened to me without interruption, as I told him everything, from the video by Charlie Kirk to the dream in the desert. When I finished, he placed his hand on my shoulder and asked with serenity, "Farid, are you ready to follow Jesus no matter the cost?" That question hung in the air. I knew what it meant. In Iran, saying that was not a simple decision. It meant risking everything, the position, the security, my very life. But at that moment, I felt the same presence from the dream, the same fire in my chest. I took a deep breath and answered, yes. That very night, in a small bathtub behind the house, the pastor baptized me. The light was dim, only a hanging bulb illuminated the place. The sound of the water hitting the edges echoed like a gentle song. When I was immersed, everything seemed to stop. As I came out, I felt a lightness I had never experienced before. It was not a passing emotion. It was as if I had been washed inside, reborn. There were no uniforms, no titles, no masks. I was just Farid, and for the first time I felt complete. In the days that followed, everything gained new meaning. I was still the colonel, still wore the uniform, but now I knew who truly commanded me. The prayers were no longer rituals. They were sincere conversations. The Bible became my manual for life, and the words that once felt distant now burned within me. One day, while reviewing reports at the barracks, one of the young soldiers, Kamal, approached. His face showed exhaustion, and his eyes seemed to be asking for help. He closed the door and in a whisper asked, "Colonel, is Jesus real?" I stayed silent for a few seconds. My heart began to race. I remembered the desert, the golden field, the voice that said, "Follow me." I took a deep breath and said, "Yes, Kamal. He is real, more real than anything I have ever seen." I told him about the dream, the peace, the weight that had vanished, and as I spoke, tears began streaming from his eyes. "I want this Jesus," he said. That moment was indescribable. The man who for so many years had trained soldiers for war was now teaching one of them how to find peace. The same God who had reached me through videos, dreams and pain was now using my life to reach another heart. That night I took Kamal to meet Pastor Youssef, and there, in the same bathtub where I had been baptized, he too was immersed in the waters of faith. I looked at that scene and realized that none of it was coincidence. Everything was part of a greater plan, of a grace that began with a simple click on a video and became an avalanche that no one could stop. I went back home and hugged Mina tightly. She was crying, giving thanks. "You have no idea how much I prayed for this," she whispered. I just smiled. There was no need to say anything. The God who had answered my questions had also heard her prayers. That was only the beginning. I felt that something greater was coming, and that no matter how high the price, I could never go back. After the secret baptism, my life was never the same. The peace I felt was impossible to describe in human words. It was as if, for the first time, I could breathe pure air after years trapped in a windowless room. But along with that peace came the siege. At first, the changes inside me were subtle, almost imperceptible to others. I still wore the same uniform, still gave the same orders, still walked through the barracks hallways with the same posture. But there was something different in my eyes, and people notice when something changes, especially when that change comes from the soul. The looks began, small, quick, but sharp. Whispers when I walked by, tight smiles that no longer meant respect but suspicion. On my office desk, the Bible I had once read in secret began to stay open among reports and papers, and I would read it when no one was around. Sometimes I locked the door and read Psalm 23 in a low voice, like a spiritual shield against the fear that lingered around me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Those words became my routine, my breath, my quiet strength. At home, the atmosphere also began to change. Mina felt the weight of the streets, the glances from neighbors, the questions that no one dared to ask directly. Our sons, Arman and Dariush, came home from school silent, sometimes crying. One afternoon, I found Arman sitting on the floor of his room, his face buried in his knees. When I asked what had happened, he answered in a trembling voice, "Father, they said we are traitors, that our mother serves a forbidden God." My heart tightened with a pain that was not physical, but sharp. I held my son and said nothing. I just prayed silently. I knew my choice was costing dearly to those I loved most. The days that followed brought even greater consequences. I received an official notice from the army. We were being removed from military housing. No explanations, no right to defense, just an order. We were forced to pack years of life into a few boxes. I remember the night we left that house. Mina, though exhausted, prayed softly. The boys, confused, tried to understand why we were leaving what had seemed a safe home. "Because now we serve a greater king," she said, and her words filled the car with a faith I was still learning to understand. We returned to Bandar Bushehr, to a small house near the port. The air was heavy with humidity and the future uncertain. My parents learned about the move, and when I went to visit them, my father's look said everything. There was no hatred, but there was shame. He did not need to speak. The silence was enough. I, the son he had once been so proud of, was now the subject of comments, humiliation, and disgrace. I left with a knot in my throat. That night, I knelt on the floor of my room and asked God for strength to continue, even if everything around me collapsed. Suspicion among my army colleagues grew. Small incidents began to happen. Papers disappeared from my desk. Reports I had never written appeared signed with my name. It was as if someone were trying to build a case against me. Still, I remained calm. I continued doing what I knew was right. I discipled in silence. At night, I met with Kamal, that same soldier who had converted after hearing my testimony. We read the Gospels by the dim light of an oil lamp, and he asked questions with the heart of someone who wanted to learn everything at once. Each word of Jesus seemed to open windows in our souls. I also began attending more often the gatherings of the house church, Jamaat Rabbani. It was a small group of simple people, but their faith was so alive that it was impossible not to be moved. We sang softly, almost whispering, so as not to attract attention from the neighbors. The curtains remained closed, and the sound of hymns blended with the distant noise of the streets. There was always that fear of a knock at the door, but at the same time there was something stronger, a flame that no regime could extinguish. Each gathering was an experience of faith and resistance. It was there, in that hidden community, that I realized the seed planted by a simple video from Charlie Kirk had grown into a deep root. The man who once spent sleepless nights planning military strategies now spent long hours praying for souls. I was no longer the colonel who commanded men. I was a disciple learning to follow the true commander. And even with the tightening pressure, something inside me said there was no turning back. But it was in September of 2018 that everything changed. A month I will never forget. I was invited to a secret Christian conference held in a secluded house with leaders from several cities. It was risky, but I felt I had to go. That night, the air felt heavy. Pastor Youssef prayed with fervor, and every word seemed to set the room on fire. We spoke about courage, about how the gospel could not be silenced. And it was precisely at the height of that worship that hell knocked on the door. A crash. The door burst open. Armed soldiers stormed in, shouting. The sound of boots, weapons, and orders echoed like thunder. We were thrown against the walls, Bibles scattered across the floor, the air filled with dust and fear. Someone shouted my name. "Farid Nazari, you are under arrest." I was handcuffed in front of my brothers and sisters in faith. One of the soldiers recognized me and whispered, "Traitor." The walk to the truck was a march of shame. I knew I was being taken to Evin, the place where sounds do not escape, where prayers are whispered behind bars. The following days were a mix of interrogations and forced silence. The agents wanted me to deny my faith, to say that everything had been a mistake. The questions came like knives. Why did you betray Islam? Why did you deceive the army? I stayed calm. I only said, "I follow the truth." Each time I spoke the name of Jesus, they slammed the table. But inside me, peace never left. The first trial came quickly. I was sentenced to 3 years in prison, expelled from the army, and had my pension revoked. I lost everything I had built, and even so, what I felt was not defeat, it was freedom. Yet the storm was not over. Soon after came a second trial. This time, the accusation was more serious: apostasy and proselytizing. I knew what that meant. The sentence could be final. The night before the hearing, I knelt on the cold floor of my cell. I remembered the dream in the desert, the gaze of Jesus, the voice that said, "Farid, follow me." And that was what I said to him. I still follow you, even if it's to the end. The next day, before the court, the judge looked at me with a cold stare. He spoke for long minutes, listing my transgressions, and then, in a sudden silence, he said something that stunned me. No basis for conviction under Sharia. I could barely understand. It was impossible. It was a miracle. I later learned that Christians from various countries had been praying for me, mentioning my name, asking God to deliver me. I did not know any of them, but heaven itself had moved because of a faith that crossed borders. I was sent back to Evin to serve the 3 years, but alive. My time in prison was a war of the soul. The walls were cold, the air heavy, the shouts of the guards echoing like nightmares. Some days, I received hidden letters from Mina. She said the boys were well, that they prayed every night, and that God was taking care of us. Those letters were like pieces of light within the darkness. But the true turning point came years later, after I was free. One night, during a meeting in the church basement, while we were preparing the bread and wine for communion, the door opened. It was Mahmoud, an old colleague from the army, the same one who had betrayed me years before. The man responsible for destroying my career, my reputation, and for sending me to prison. He looked different. His face was weary, his eyes filled with tears. He took a step forward and said, his voice trembling, "Farid, I betrayed you. I was the one who reported you. But later, I read the Bible, and now, I want what you have." I stood in silence. Everything in me screamed to push him away. The memories came back like a film. The cold cell, Arman's wounded face, Mina's despair, my father's shame. But at the same time, I felt that same voice inside me, the same one from the desert, and it said, "Forgive." I took a step forward and looked into his eyes. "Mahmoud," I said, "I forgive you." He fell to his knees and began to weep. In that instant, I realized that forgiveness was more powerful than any weapon, more freeing than any sentence, because that forgiveness opened a new door, not just for me, but for everyone who was there. From that night on, the name of Jesus began to echo more strongly among those who had once hated me. Mahmoud not only converted, but became one of the most fervent disciples of the faith. And many who had taken part in my denunciation began seeking the same peace that had transformed me. What had begun as a seed planted by online videos had become an avalanche of grace within a country that tried to silence the voice of truth. The faith that had saved me in the desert was now saving others. And deep in my soul, I knew there was still much more to come.
The story of Farid Nazari is more than a testimony. It is a calling. A reminder that no past is too great for the love of God, and that even where fear reigns, the light of Christ can enter and transform everything. Farid was not saved by chance. He was found. And perhaps today, the same God who reached him in the desert is calling you too. If right now you feel that touch in your heart, that presence bringing peace and hope, say out loud, "I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior." And write in the comments this declaration of faith: "I accept Jesus." This simple phrase can mark the beginning of a new life, a new story, just as it did for Farid. If this testimony spoke to you, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and write below, "I love Jesus." This is our way of spreading faith and reaching even more people with messages of transformation. And get ready. The next video is already appearing on your screen, and it will deeply move you. It is an unbelievable story. From Islam to Christ, a descendant of Muhammad watches. Charlie Kirk and meets Jesus in a dream. A journey of faith, courage, and revelation that you need to see until the end. Click now and get ready for another true testimony that will renew your faith and show once again that no one is ever too far to be reached by the love of Jesus.